Okay, then I would like to invite Roger Grau, who is going to tell us something about how drought increases fire severity and alters vegetation in heathlands and peat bogs. He's coming from Glasgow in the UK.
Yeah, well, hi everybody. My name is Roger Grau from University of Glasgow, and I'm going to talk about the effect of fire severity on community composition on heather moorlands. Heather moorlands are upland habitats dominated by dwarf shrubs, most commonly Calluna vulgaris. Their habitat range from dry heath on thin pot soils to wet heath on thick organic soils. Moorland vegetation can also dominate in raised bogs where there's been some degradation, for example, from drainage. And I'll be explaining a little bit more about vegetation later on. Heather moorlands are typically found in Northwest Europe, including Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Italy, and northern Spain, but are best represented in the UK and Ireland. They are globally rare habitats with a distinct fauna and flora, so they are considered to have a high conservation importance. They also tend to overlay carbon-rich soil, so they also are an important carbon store. Many moorlands have resulting from a strong influence from human activities such as sheep grazing, prescrite burning for livestock and game, and drainage for afforestation. In the United Kingdom, prescrite burning is a commonly used land management tool, especially for deer and grouse management in sporting states. Prescrite burning is usually performed as head fires to minimize damage to ground vegetation in narrow strips of around 30 meters wide. Prescrite burning is allowed from the 1st of October to the 15th of April to avoid damage to ground nesting birds and also to avoid fire control issues because of drier weather. So despite prescrite burning being a commonly used land management tool in Calluna moorlands, we do not have a good understanding of the effect of fire behavior on community composition. So the objective of this study was to investigate the effect of higher fire severity prescrite fires on community composition in heather moorlands. To cover the range of habitats in which Calluna dominates, we set out experiments in two different sites with very different ecohydrological characteristics. The first one was Glen Tanner, which is a dry heath with thin organic soils. And the second one is Brayhead Moss, which is a raised bog with deep peat and which is saturated throughout most of its profile. We used these drought shelters to lower the fuel moisture content of 2 by 2 meter plots, and this resulted in, especially in lower fuel moisture content of the ground vegetation, of the moss and litter layer, and also lower fuel moisture content of the soil in the case of the dry heath. And these resulted in a higher severity in those dried plots. Higher severity measured as soil heating during the fire at the soil surface, so below the moss layer. So in both sites, fire severity was higher in drought plots than in no drought plots, and in general terms, fire severity was higher in the dry heath than in the raised bog because of wetter ground in the raised bog and the thicker moss layer as well. I'm going to give a quick overview of the kind of vegetation that we can find in Calluna moorland. So this picture shows the typical structure of the vegetation. There's a dense canopy of Calluna, 77% in the dwarf shrub, in the dry heath side, 64% in the raised bog. And then there's a continuous layer of mosses, of Plerocarpus mosses that cover the soil. In terms of above ground canopy, other common dwarf shrub species are Erica cinerea, Erica tetralix, Vaccinium species. In terms of graminoids, the Strampliflexuosa dominated in the dry heath. Eriophorum species, which are typical of wetter sites and are also peat-forming species, dominated in the raised bog. Forbs were mostly found in the dry heath. The most common ones were Potentilla erecta, Gallium saxatile. As for the bryophyte layer, it was dominated by Plerocarpus mosses. Plerocarpus mosses are also known as feather mosses, which grow horizontally, forming a mat on top of the soil. So Plerosium cerbi dominated in the dry heath. Hypnodium landicum was the most common one by far in the raised bog. Also common were Acrocarpus mosses, which are mosses that grow vertically, and the Canoscoparium, Polytrichum uniperinum were common ones. And the last group of vegetation I wanted to mention is the Sphagnum mosses, which are mosses of very wet places, so were only found in the raised bog. And these are a particularly important group of vegetation because of traits that are considered to be very important for peatland ecology. So they have a high water holding capacity, they are very acidic, and they are peat-forming species. We surveyed the vegetation just once in each site, but because we burned the fires at different times, we got a range of time since fire, so from 1 to 2 years. Community composition was analyzed with a detrended correspondence analysis, which is an ordination technique. So ordination produces this ordination plot, which essentially displays or expresses ecological distance or ecological similarities between species, which are represented here by red crosses, and between plots as well, which are represented here by circles of different colors depending on the treatment of the plot. So, for example, species that are close together, that means that they are ecologically similar, which means that when one is abundant in a plot, the other one tends to be abundant as well. And similarly for plots that are close together in an ordination diagram, that means that they have a similar community composition. So here these plots are unburned plots, and on all, this means that all have a similar community composition, which is mainly formed of these species that are close by in the ordination diagram. Another characteristic of ordination diagrams is that they order the variation in community composition along two main axes of variation. The horizontal one is the main one, the one which explains most of the variation in the data, and the secondary one is the vertical one. So here, this is an ordination diagram for the dry heath, and what we can see is that the main axis of variation, what explains most of the variation in the data, is related to treatment. So there's a clear treatment effect with unburned plots at one end, high severity plots at the other, lower severity burned plots sort of in the middle. And another thing that we can see here is that heterogeneity in community composition is larger in burned plots, particularly in higher severity plots, than in unburned plots, which are much closer together in the diagram. So this means, in other words, that beta diversity is higher in higher severity burned plots. Now, if we focus on species and on burned plots only, we can also superimpose the effect of environmental variables, which allows us to interpret the variation in the data. What is driving the variation in the community composition that we observe? So here we have fire severity increasing in this direction, mainly related to the horizontal axis, the main axis of variation, and then time since fire related to the secondary axis. So what we can infer from here is that forbs, Potentilla erecta, Gallium saxatile, were more abundant at higher values of fire severity. Graminoids, Agrostis, Capillaris agrostis species were also common at higher values of fire severity, and the same for Vaccinium and Erica cinerea, so dwarf shrubs as well. And on the other hand, species that were abundant at low values of fire severity were mostly Plerocarpus mosses, Plerosium undulatum, Rhytidelphus corosus, Hypnodium landicum, Plerosium cerebi, Hylocomium splendens. All of these are common Plerocarpus mosses, all more abundant at low fire severity values. This is the ordination diagram for the raised bog. So we see similar patterns as the one in the dry heath, with the main axis of variation related to treatment. And again, we see higher heterogeneity of community composition, higher beta diversity in burn plots. If we look at species and focus only on burn plots, again, we can superimpose fire severity, which in this case is in the second axis of variation. And here we can see is that the species that were more abundant at high fire severity levels were mostly Acrocarpus mosses, so Campylopus flexuosus, Campylopus interflexus, Ceratodon purpureus. And then again, as in the dry heath, species that were most strongly associated with low fire severity were Plerocarpus mosses, Rhytidelphus corosus, Hypnodium landicum, Plerosium cerebi. And somewhat surprisingly, Sphagnum species were more abundant at intermediate levels of fire severity. So here it's Sphagnum capillifolium, which is by far the most dominant Sphagnum species. And I say surprisingly because there's concern that prescribed burning, or any kind of disturbance in peatlands is going to be detrimental for Sphagnum species, and this doesn't show that. So to summarize, fire increased beta diversity in both sites, and this is probably related to the fact that fire behavior is very heterogeneous at small spatial scales, so that thus creating microenvironmental conditions that allow establishment of a higher variety of species. Higher severity fires resulted in low abundance of plerocarps. This is likely to do with the higher combustion of Plerocarpus mats with higher severity fires. And this also probably allowed other species to establish. In the case of the dry heath, the fact that the Plerocarpus mat was partly consumed allowed establishment of forbs, dwarf shrubs, and graminoids, and in the case of the raised bog, it was mainly acrocarps, which increased in abundance. And at intermediate fire severities, we found a higher abundance of sphagnum mosses. So to conclude, we related in this study variation in fire severity to variation in community composition in these ecosystems. And this is useful in the sense of, or for practitioners performing prescribed fires, as it can inform under which conditions to perform the fires to achieve specific land management objectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger. Are there any questions? Yeah, well, I had a short question. I was wondering whether you think that if the recurrency of the fire would increase, whether the plant communities would also really change, or what do you think that still remain the same communities?
Well, so you're asking me if the recurrency of the fires changed, then would that affect community composition?
Yes.
Yes, I would guess so, but I haven't really looked at recurrent fires, so I can't really tell you much about it.
Okay, no
Sorry.
worries. Okay, then we can move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much.